Now, before moving to the actual case studies, let us start with the foundational work, with an analysis. If there are conditions, or if there exist conditions that can create a totalitarian regime, or that can support a totalitarian movement in 21st century. Here is my argument. I think some of the conditions that exist starting with the beginning of this century, 21st century, are somehow perfect to complement or support a totalitarian movement. And let me start with numbering these conditions. First, the events of 9/11 and the discourse that started with those events created globally an environment of fear and insecurity. Fear of sometimes an objective enemy, and fear of sometimes an imagined enemy. And this discourse was rather, it was global. Unlike the totalitarian movements of early 20th century, what we see here, a phenomenon that existed across the different sections of global society. That discourse will be followed by addition, and what we will have as British 9/11, the terrorist attacks in Britain, Chinese 9/11, the terrorist attacks in China, Indian 9/11, the terrorist attacks in India, and so on and so forth. Every nation, whosoever will confront a particular security event will be labeled, that event will particularly be labeled as terrorism from a particular group or a particular community, and will be called as terrorist attacks, and will contribute to that ever-growing industry of fear and insecurity. If anything, this represents, it is perhaps some of the relevant aspects of imperialism that started in the late 19th century and ended till the early 20th century. That again had a global reach and a discourse that would create an image which would be inclusive, but also limited to a particular group, and which would also be global in reach. Second, the invention of new means of communication. And by that, I generally mean the mass media, but particularly mean the social media. Although it is considered democratic that one has the platform in a society to express the opinion and to have the opinion first and then to express that opinion, and to be confronted with counter opinion, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, if you look at Hannah Arendt's conceptualization of atomized individual who is isolated and who depends on the repetition of a particular discourse rather than on facts or rather than on reason, what you will find on ground, the impact of social media platforms, creating the isolated, atomized individuals who are, as Hannah Arendt says, on the one hand, they are self-centric because they look at themselves, someone who is victim of a larger, bigger injustice in the society, but at the same time, who is also volunteer in contributing to a movement that will counter that injustice. So in this regard, is also someone who cares for a particular group. On the one hand, self-centric, on the other, selfless. Now, observe the impact of social media, and most of you will find those atomized individuals who somewhere, somehow believe that they are the victim of status quo, or they are the victim of some of the ideological policies that have been dominating in the past 2 or 3 decades, or the international order, and so on and so forth. You will find a victimhood, a greater victimhood, injustice, and then a strong, illogical, irrational attachment to an ideology that merely presents itself as repetition of its own discourse, self-created discourse and mantra. That is the second important aspect that I think is the condition in 21st century that can facilitate totalitarian movements. Thirdly, 21st century, and this is not limited to 21st century, this has been happening in the past at least 200 years, but it has reached its peak in 21st century. The process of creating a society of winners and losers. And this is the result of that growth-centric economic mantra that has been there for past many decades. That has ultimately created a larger segment of society who feels being detached, isolated from the existing reality, and is rather atomized already and feeling the victimness, being the victim of an injustice. We have seen this in some of the right-wing populist movements, some of the theories and arguments that were presented from these right-wing movements. You will see a strong sense of victimhood, victimness, and at the same time, you will see fear and anger playing its role. I think these three are so far, I believe, these three conditions qualify to be called as something that might eventually end up in facilitating the totalitarian movements. Now the question is whether we have the totalitarian movements of same nature as there were in the 20th century, or these movements are somewhat different. The answer depends on the socio-political and economic structures of a given society. We might have totalitarian movements that are somewhat similar to some of the movements in the early 20th century. For example, you can relate a populist, right-wing populist movement that is very much closer to a totalitarian movement in India. You can relate that movement to the Nazi movement, anti-Semitic Nazi movement in early 20th century. That some of the movements might have different nature or different characteristics. In some cases, we might find additional characteristics. In some cases, we might find premature characteristics of a totalitarian regime. But there are some preconditions that exist on global level that can facilitate a totalitarian movement. And I will try in the case studies section to relate these preconditions to some of the particular cases that we will discuss in our class.